The hum of a Boeing 777 at 38,000 feet is a sound of peaceful monotony, a lullaby in a pressurized cabin. But on Global Wings Flight 815 from Dallas to London, that peace was about to be shattered. This wasn't a story about turbulence or engine trouble. It was about a storm brewing inside the cabin. A storm of prejudice directed at a 17-year-old boy with a cello case in the overhead bin and a dream in his heart. "We serve paying customers first." The words sliced through the pressurized cabin of Atlantic Airways Flight 723 like a blade dropping into a sudden pocket of silence. Several passengers looked up from their screens, startled by the sharp tone. The black teenager in seat 24A froze cup holder still extended hand suspended in midair as senior flight attendant Veronica Whitfield deliberately pushed her beverage cart forward without serving him. The Boeing 787 cruised at 37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, 7 hours still remaining on its journey from Atlanta to Paris. But in exactly 42 minutes, First Officer Nathan Reynolds would step out of that cockpit door, and the trajectory of everyone involved would change as irrevocably as if the aircraft itself had suddenly altered course. Before we dive deeper into what happens next, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. This isn't just another viral video. It's about that crucial moment when speaking up transforms from option to necessity. Elijah Thomas lowered his hand slowly, the familiar weight of invisibility settling across his shoulders. At 17, he'd developed an acute awareness of when to press an issue and when to retreat into stillness. This moment aboard an international flight surrounded by strangers clearly called for the latter. His long fingers returned to tracing the edges of his phone where Bach's cello suite num. 1 was displayed the calluses on his fingertips, catching slightly against the screen protector. 6 years of daily practice had hardened his hands while refining his touch and irony his mother often noted with a mixture of pride and melancholy. "Your hands tell your story," she'd say, holding them in her own nurse's palms, roughened by hospital-grade sanitizer and long shifts. "Remember that when you play." Elijah wore dark jeans and a simple navy button-down clothes Denise Thomas had carefully selected for the journey, professional enough for the conservatoire, but comfortable for the 8-hour flight. His mother had worked double shifts for 6 months to afford this ticket, coming home at dawn, bone-tired, sometimes still in her scrubs as she collapsed on the couch. His father had walked out when Elijah was 4, leaving behind only a collection of jazz records and a vague promise to be in touch. That same week, Elijah had first heard a cello during an elementary school assembly. The instrument's voice, deep resonant, capable of both melancholy and joy, had filled a space inside him he hadn't known was empty. When he'd told his mother he wanted to learn, she'd taken on her first extra shift. "Music found you when you needed it most," she'd explained years later. "That's not coincidence, that's purpose." His dark locks were neatly tied back with a simple band revealing features that carried an intensity beyond his years. Not from hardship, though he'd known his share, but from the focused discipline required to master an instrument that demanded both technical precision and emotional truth. This flight wasn't just transportation. It was the threshold to possibility, a prestigious audition at the Conservatoire de Paris that could change everything. The International Youth Scholarship would mean full tuition housing and a stipend for 4 years. It would mean his mother could finally reduce her punishing schedule, maybe even return to school herself, as she'd always dreamed. The cello itself, a restored instrument his high school orchestra teacher had helped him acquire through a music foundation, Grant was securely stowed in the climate-controlled closet at the front of the cabin. Watching it disappear in its reinforced flight case had made his heart race with anxiety until the gate agent Gabriela Rodriguez had stepped in. She'd noticed his expression and paused, hand on the case. "This is your voice, isn't it?" she'd asked softly, understanding in her eyes. "I played violin through college. Nothing this serious, but I get it." She'd made a special note in the system and personally walked him to pre-boarding. "We'll guard it like a Stradivarius," she'd promised. Now, as the cabin air grew increasingly dry, Elijah fought the urge to ask again for something to drink. His throat tightened, not just from dehydration, but from the familiar tightness that came with being erased. He'd felt it when security followed him through the music store but ignored the white teenagers pocketing guitar picks. He'd felt it when a competition judge had questioned whether he'd really prepared his piece without help. He closed his eyes briefly, focusing instead on the complex fingering pattern of the Bach prelude. Tomorrow he would stand before the judging panel at one of the world's most prestigious music conservatories. Today's indignities were merely turbulence to be navigated uncomfortable but ultimately irrelevant to his destination. Veronica Whitfield moved the beverage cart with practiced efficiency, her body operating on the muscle memory built over 22 years of flight service. At 48, she knew every inch of the aircraft cabin like a surgeon knows an operating theater. Each space had its purpose, each interaction its protocol, each moment its proper sequence. Her Atlantic Airways uniform navy blazer with crisp white blouse and precisely knotted silk scarf was a second skin worn with the kind of meticulous attention that transformed clothing into armor. Not a thread loose, not a wrinkle visible, her blonde bob shaped with military precision makeup, applied with surgical accuracy. The perfect flight attendant exactly as the airline's grooming standards pictured. What those standards didn't capture was the hardening that had occurred beneath the surface over 2 decades of service. The genuine smile of a young woman who had once dreamed of seeing the world had calcified into a professional mask activated by muscle reflex rather than authentic warmth. The passengers didn't see the divorce finalized 6 months ago after 18 years of marriage. Her husband claiming emotional abandonment while conveniently forgetting the flight attendant's schedule had been part of their lives since day one. They didn't see the mortgage payments she could barely make on her current salary, or the promotion to purser she'd been passed over for 3 times despite her seniority. The most recent rejection still stung. "We're looking for someone who better represents Atlantic's forward-facing values," her supervisor had explained, avoiding direct eye contact, while delivering the news that Miguel Ramirez, 10 years her junior, with significantly less experience, would become the new purser instead. That night alone in her too-big suburban house with its outdated kitchen her ex had always promised to renovate, she'd poured herself 3 fingers of bourbon and allowed the bitterness to surface. Forward-facing values, she'd muttered to the empty room. Right. Over time, Veronica's world had sorted itself into increasingly rigid categories. First class versus economy, compliant versus non-compliant, deserving versus undeserving. These divisions gave order to a life that increasingly felt beyond her control. They were efficient, predictable, safe. She would never acknowledge, not even in private moments of self-reflection, how often these categories aligned with deeper biases she'd absorbed from a childhood in a small rural community where diversity was theoretical rather than lived experience. She considered herself colorblind, yet somehow found herself scrutinizing certain passengers more closely, finding infractions where none existed, enforcing protocols selectively. As she prepared the galley for the first beverage service, she mentally cataloged the passengers in her section with practiced assessment. The businessman in 22C likely to request multiple alcoholic beverages, potential problem. The elderly couple in 23E and F would need extra time but were properly deferential. The teenager in 24A had looked at her with what she perceived as attitude during boarding headphones on taking up too much space. Potential disruption. "We've got a full flight today," Miguel commented as he organized juice containers beside her. At 34, his natural enthusiasm hadn't yet been ground down by years of service. His recent promotion hung unspoken between them. "Did you see the kid with the cello? Apparently, he's heading to some big audition in Paris. The gate agents were talking about it, some kind of prodigy." Veronica's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "Wonderful," she replied, her tone perfectly neutral while her mind categorized special treatment already. "Expects exceptions to be made. Let's hope our prodigy keeps his special status in his seat and doesn't become a problem." Miguel gave her a quick sideways glance but said nothing. There was a careful calculation in his silence which conversations were worth having, which would only harden already formed opinions. Neither of them could have predicted that within hours this flight would become a case study in Atlantic Airways training materials, and Veronica Whitfield's name would feature prominently in everything flight attendants should never do. The massive Rolls-Royce engines created a cocoon of white noise as Flight 723 reached cruising altitude, the smooth transition from climb to level flight barely perceptible except to the most anxious travelers. The seatbelt sign chimed off, triggering the choreographed routine of a long-haul flight passengers, stretching retrieving items from bags, flight attendants beginning their service preparations. Elijah had boarded early heart-pounding as he watched ground crew handle his cello case. The reinforced flight case had cost nearly as much as the instrument itself, a protective shell designed to withstand temperature changes, pressure differentials, and the occasional careless baggage handler. 3 years of saving birthday money competition winnings and street performance tips had gone into that purchase. First time flying with your instrument, Gabriela Rodriguez had asked, noticing his white-knuckled grip on the boarding pass. First time flying at all, Elijah had admitted quietly. Her eyebrows had lifted in surprise. "And you're going all the way to Paris?" "For the conservatoire audition." When he'd nodded, something in her expression had shifted from professional courtesy to genuine connection. "My brother played cello through college," she'd said. "Not nearly good enough for where you're heading, but I recognize that look, someone carrying their heartbeat in a case." The unexpected understanding had momentarily eased the knot of anxiety in his chest. Gabriela had personally walked him to the aircraft, speaking with the cabin crew about the special handling required. "This young man is our special guest today," she'd said, her voice carrying just enough authority to ensure he was treated with extra care. Now settled into 24A window seat. Elijah gazed at the impossible geography of clouds below. The woman beside him in 24B, Isabel Garza, had a kind face framed by silver-streaked black hair, pulled back in a practical bun. Reading glasses hung from a beaded chain around her neck, and her hands, though showing signs of age, moved with elegant precision as she organized her travel items. "First flight?" she asked gently when she noticed his grip tighten during a minor patch of turbulence. "Is it that obvious?" Elijah asked, embarrassed. "Only to someone who used to white-knuckle it herself," Isabel replied with a warm smile. "I'm Isabel. Taught high school music for 38 years before retiring last spring. Now I'm treating myself to the European tour I promised myself back when I started teaching. I'm Elijah. I play cello," he said, then immediately felt foolish stating something so obvious. "Going to the conservatoire auditions?" she asked, surprising him. When he nodded, she continued, "I recognized the Bach on your phone. Suite number 1, Prelude. I had a student play it for all state once. Powerful piece when performed with both technical skill and emotional honesty." Her casual expertise in his chosen field created an immediate connection. As they spoke about music theory and performance anxiety, Elijah felt his nervousness about the flight recede slightly. But as the beverage service began, he noticed Veronica Whitfield watching him during her preparations in the galley. Their eyes met briefly before she looked away. Her expression shifting in a subtle way he recognized immediately from years of similar encounters. It was the look of someone who had already decided who he was without knowing anything about him. A look that placed him firmly in the problem category before he'd said a single word. Elijah turned back to the window, focusing on the vast expanse of clouds. He'd navigated spaces where he wasn't welcome before. This was just temporary turbulence on the path to somewhere that actually mattered. 1 hour into the flight, the rhythmic rumble of approaching service carts announced the beginning of beverage service. Elijah had retreated into his music headphones, creating a protective bubble of Bach's mathematical precision. His finger traced the complex patterns on his phone screen, mentally rehearsing the fingering positions that his body had committed to muscle memory through thousands of repetitions. In the prelude's flowing arpeggios, he found the calm center he needed before performances, a meditative state where technical demands and emotional expression balanced perfectly. Tomorrow's audition loomed in his mind, simultaneously terrifying and thrilling. Just 20 international applicants had been selected for in-person auditions. The YouTube recording he'd submitted had opened the door. Now he needed to prove it wasn't a fluke. A gentle tap on his arm broke his concentration. Isabel smiled apologetically. "Sorry to interrupt your practice, but they're asking what you'd like to drink," she said, nodding toward the aisle. Elijah removed his headphones, looking up to find Veronica Whitfield standing beside the beverage cart. Something in her posture, the slight stiffening when their eyes met, sent a familiar warning signal through his body. He'd felt it countless times before, that subtle shift when someone decided he didn't belong. "Could I have apple juice, please?" Elijah asked, his voice clear but deliberately modulated, not too loud, not too soft. Carefully neutral. The constant calibration of tone, volume, and expression was second nature now, an exhausting necessity he'd learned through painful experience. Veronica's gaze flickered over him, taking in his locks, his headphones, his youth, and something in her expression hardened imperceptibly. Without acknowledging his request, she turned to Isabel. "What can I get for you, ma'am?" she asked, her professional tone carrying a warmth noticeably absent when addressing Elijah. "I'd like tomato juice, please," Isabel replied. "And the young man here asked for apple juice." Veronica poured a cup of orange juice and handed it to Isabel. "We're running low on tomato juice. I need to save it for passengers who pre-ordered special meals." Without looking at Elijah again, she turned to the businessman across the aisle in 24C. "And for you, sir, we have a full selection available." The contrast in her tone from dismissive to accommodating in the space of seconds wasn't subtle. The businessman, James Wilson, glanced between Elijah and Veronica with a slight narrowing of his eyes before requesting club soda. Elijah remained perfectly still, cup holder still extended, hand half raised as Veronica proceeded to serve the passengers in the row behind him, then pushed the cart forward. He slowly lowered his hand, feeling the familiar weight of invisibility settle across his shoulders. Isabel stared after Veronica, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension. "Did she just—" she began, then stopped, turning to Elijah. "Would you like me to call her back?" "No, thank you," Elijah replied automatically, the response practiced and immediate. He forced a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's fine. I'm not that thirsty anyway." But as he returned to Bach's intricate patterns, the notes blurred slightly on the screen. The music that had centered him moments before now seemed distant, disconnected from the physical reality of sitting in seat 24A, having just been deliberately erased by someone with power over his basic comfort for the next 7 hours. It wasn't about the juice. It never was about whatever small thing was denied. It was about the message behind the denial. You don't matter. You don't deserve basic courtesy. You are less than. The first time he'd truly understood this distinction, he'd been 9 years old visiting a music store with his mother. While she'd spoken with the clerk about Rosen for his bow, he'd wandered toward the display of professional cellos drawn by their gleaming wood and perfect craftsmanship. He hadn't touched anything he'd known better, but the security guard had materialized instantly, hovering uncomfortably close, while ignoring the white children actually handling expensive violins nearby. When he'd told his mother later, confusion and hurt evident in his voice, she'd held him close for a long moment before carefully explaining a reality he'd need to navigate for the rest of his life. It's not fair, she'd acknowledged, her voice tight with controlled anger and sorrow. And it's not about you, not really. But you'll need to be twice as careful, twice as polite, twice as controlled as anyone else. now 13,000 feet above the Atlantic, Elijah. Thomas took a deep breath and returned to Bach, focusing on the mathematics of music where merit alone determined value. 36 minutes before everything would change on Flight 723, he retreated into the one space where he had always belonged unconditionally. 36 minutes before First Officer Reynolds would step through the cockpit door, Elijah struggled to recapture the focus that had been disrupted by the beverage service incident. The familiar warning system in his mind, honed through years of similar encounters, had fully activated, placing him on high alert. Was he overthinking it? His mother always cautioned him about assuming malice, where carelessness might explain a situation. "Not everything is about race, baby," she'd say with the weary wisdom of someone who'd navigated these waters far longer than he had. Sometimes people are just having a bad day. And yet, the flight attendant had served everyone else in his vicinity. She'd offered the businessman across the aisle a full selection immediately after claiming they needed to save certain drinks. Her eyes had passed over him as if he were invisible, a technique he recognized from countless similar encounters. His body knew the truth before his mind fully processed it. His heartbeat had quickened slightly. His muscles tensed imperceptibly. His breathing became more deliberate, the physical manifestation of the mental calculus that ran constantly in situations like this. React risk being labeled aggressive, difficult threatening. Stay silent, accept the indignity, preserve peace, prioritize safety. It was never just about one incident. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small erasures over time. Like the 9th grade orchestra teacher who'd suggested he might be more comfortable with percussion instead of the cello he'd played since 4th grade. Or last year when the competition judge had asked with thinly veiled skepticism if he had additional help preparing his piece while white students received compliments on their natural talent. Elijah glanced around the cabin, businessmen working on laptops, families watching movies together, flight attendants moving efficiently through the aisles, all participating in the unspoken contract of air travel, the temporary community of strangers sharing space for a fixed duration. All except him, apparently. Veronica passed by his row again, responding promptly to a call button 3 rows ahead. Her eyes slid over him as if he occupied a different dimension present, but not quite worthy of acknowledgement. The deliberate nature of the exclusion was impossible to miss now. A memory surfaced, his mother sitting beside him on the porch steps after he'd been passed over for first chair, despite clearly outperforming the student who received the position. "There will always be people who try to make you feel small," she'd said, her nurse's hands, strong, capable hands that had supported them both, resting on his shoulders. "The question is whether you let them succeed." He'd been 13 then, anger and hurt burning hot beneath his skin. "So I'm just supposed to accept it. That's not fair." "No, baby, you're not supposed to accept it," she'd corrected gently. "But you do have to choose your battles carefully. Some are worth fighting immediately, others need a different approach. The most important thing is not to let anyone steal your music." Now, as Veronica deliberately avoided his section again, Elijah turned up the volume on his headphones, forcing himself back into Bach's structured world. His fingers tapped the complex rhythm against his thigh, grounding himself in the music that had become both his voice and his sanctuary. His mother's wisdom echoed in his thoughts. "Don't let them live in your head rent-free. They're not worth the space." Still, as the plane continued eastward across the Atlantic, the cabin air felt increasingly cold against his skin, or perhaps it was just the chill of exclusion making itself physical. 3 hours into the flight, the cabin temperature dropped noticeably. Elijah could see his breath forming small clouds when he exhaled. Around him, passengers huddled deeper into their clothing, or gratefully accepted the blue blankets being distributed by Miguel Ramirez, who worked methodically from the front of the cabin toward the rear. Elijah watched Miguel's approach, noting his efficient but genuinely warm interactions with passengers. When Miguel reached row 22, however, Veronica suddenly materialized beside him. "I'll take over this section," she said firmly, her voice carrying a note of authority that brooked no argument. "Captain needs to speak with you about the meal service timing." Miguel hesitated, glancing briefly toward Elijah's row before responding. "I can finish this aisle first." "I've got it," Veronica insisted, taking control of the blanket stack with a finality that ended the discussion. Miguel's expression flickered momentarily, a flash of something that might have been frustration or resignation before he nodded and headed toward the front of the aircraft. The exchange lasted mere seconds, but Elijah caught it with perfect clarity, recognizing the subtle power dynamics at play. His shoulders tensed involuntarily. The deliberate beverage skip could have been dismissed as oversight or coincidence. This direct intervention to ensure Veronica controlled service to his section eliminated that possibility. She moved down the aisle with practiced efficiency, distributing blankets with a professional smile. The elderly couple in 23E and F received theirs with murmured thanks. The businessman in 23D got not only a blanket, but a brief friendly comment about the book he was reading. Then, without breaking stride or changing expression, Veronica walked directly past row 24, continuing to row 25 behind them. The deliberate nature of the exclusion was impossible to miss, not a harried oversight, but a calculated decision. Isabel straightened in her seat, her teacher's instinct for injustice immediately triggered. "Excuse me," she called, her voice carrying clearly despite its controlled volume. "You missed our row." Veronica turned her professional mask firmly in place. "So sorry. We're running low on blankets. I need to ensure there are enough for the entire cabin." As if to immediately contradict her statement, she turned and handed blankets to all passengers in row 25, even offering a second one to a woman who mentioned being particularly cold-natured. Isabel's eyes narrowed slightly, decades of classroom management evident in her posture. But before she could respond, Veronica had already moved to the next row, continuing her distribution while pointedly avoiding eye contact. The message was unmistakable. Some passengers deserved warmth and basic comfort. Others did not. Elijah sat perfectly still, arms crossed for warmth, focusing on his breathing. The cabin's chill seemed to intensify around him, specifically seeping through his clothes and into his skin. He'd dressed for Atlanta summer and Paris fall, not for the artificial winter of high-altitude cabin pressure. After 15 minutes of watching other passengers bundle comfortably under their blankets while his teeth threatened to chatter, he reluctantly pressed the call button above his seat. The small blue light illuminated, signaling his request for assistance. 5 minutes passed. 10, 15. Flight attendants, including Veronica, walked past, glancing up at the light but continuing without stopping. The call button, supposedly a direct line to service, had become yet another reminder of his categorization. Finally, after 20 minutes, when Elijah had almost given up, Veronica appeared beside his row. She stood in the aisle with arms crossed, her posture communicating clear impatience. "Call buttons are for emergencies only," she said, her voice carrying an edge that made nearby passengers look up from their screens. "What seems to be the problem?" The emphasis on problem carried unmistakable subtext. Elijah felt eyes turning toward him, the sudden scrutiny of becoming visible only when framed as disruption. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice deliberately soft and respectful, the practiced tone of someone who had learned early that his emotions would be judged more harshly than others. "I was hoping to get a blanket. It's quite cold." Something flashed across Veronica's face. Irritation, perhaps, at being asked to acknowledge his basic needs, or frustration that he hadn't simply accepted his exclusion quietly. "As I explained earlier," she replied with exaggerated patience, "blankets are limited. If you needed one, you should have requested it when they were being distributed." Elijah felt heat rise to his face despite the cabin chill. His hands clenched briefly before he consciously relaxed them, the physical embodiment of the control he'd been taught was necessary for his safety. "But you didn't stop at our row during distribution." He pointed out, his voice still calm but firm, walking the razor's edge between self-advocacy and what could be labeled as attitude. For a split second, Veronica's professional mask slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Then it snapped back into place, her smile tightening. "I can't be expected to keep track of every passenger who wants a blanket," she replied dismissively. "Those who speak up get served first. That's how it works." The subtext hung in the air between them. Know your place. Don't ask for what others receive automatically. Isabel shifted beside him, the movement deliberate and pointed. He shouldn't have to speak up for basic service that every other passenger received without asking, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had managed classrooms for decades. Veronica's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. Perhaps next time he'll learn to be more assertive. Without waiting for response, she reached up and switched off the call button, then turned and walked away, leaving Elijah sitting in the cold hands, now trembling slightly from both temperature and the effort of containing his reaction. Isabel turned to him, outrage evident in her expression. "That was completely inappropriate," she said quietly. "Would you like me to speak with the lead attendant?" "No, thank you," Elijah said automatically, the response ingrained through years of similar moments. "I'll be fine." He would be fine because he had to be, because anything else would risk escalation, would potentially compromise his arrival in Paris or his audition. Every fiber in his body wanted to stand up to demand the same basic dignity afforded to everyone around him, to ask why he alone had been deemed unworthy of common courtesy. Instead, he sat perfectly still, the discipline that made him an exceptional cellist, now channeled into containing the complex mixture of anger, humiliation, and resignation that threatened to overwhelm him. This wasn't just about a blanket or a drink. It was about being treated as less than human, a familiar pain that never diminished no matter how often he experienced it. Isabel watched him with the perceptive gaze of someone who had taught thousands of young people. After a moment, she silently removed her own blanket and offered half of it, creating a shared space of warmth between them. Sometimes, she said quietly, refusing to accept injustice means allowing others to help when they offer. 28 minutes before the confrontation that would transform Flight 723 into international news, Elijah Thomas accepted the small act of kindness from a stranger who recognized his humanity without qualification. The gesture was simple but profound, a counterbalance to the deliberate exclusion he had experienced, a reminder that while some might try to make him invisible, others still saw him clearly. 28 minutes before the confrontation that would change everything, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from individual discomfort to collective awareness. What had begun as isolated incidents noticed only by Elijah and Isabel had expanded to include a growing circle of observers. James Wilson, the 54-year-old businessman seated across the aisle in 24C, had abandoned all pretense of working on his quarterly reports. His tablet now displayed a blank note page with time-stamped entries: 1632. FA refused drink service to young man in 24A while serving everyone else, 17 to 15. Same FA intercepts other crew member to prevent blanket distribution to 24A, 1740. Call button ignored for 20+ minutes, 17 to 42. FA suggests passenger is not assertive enough when finally responding. Wilson, dressed in an expensive but understated gray suit, had traveled over 2 million miles with Atlantic Airways. The titanium frequent flyer card in his wallet granted him access to the highest echelons of customer service, a status he'd never particularly valued until witnessing its opposite playing out beside him. His jaw tightened each time Veronica deliberately bypassed Elijah, his fingers documenting each incident with growing indignation. Behind them, in row 25, 2 teenage girls, Sophia Martinez and Taylor Johnson, both 16, had begun recording discreetly on their phones, the devices partially concealed by travel pillows. "I can't believe this is happening," Sophia whispered, angling her camera carefully between the seats. "She's literally pretending he doesn't exist." My dad's a civil rights attorney, Taylor replied, keeping her voice low. He always says document everything. This is textbook discrimination. Should we say something? Sophia asked, uncertain despite her outrage. Let's wait, Taylor advised. If we speak up now, she might just deny it. Better to have more evidence first. Across the aisle in 25D, an older man who had been sleeping since takeoff was now fully awake, watching the interaction with narrowed eyes. He caught Wilson's gaze, giving a small nod of acknowledgement, another witness cataloging the pattern of behavior. Most telling was Miguel Ramirez's reaction when he returned from the cockpit. Standing in the galley, he engaged in a hushed conversation with another flight attendant, Diane Powell, a 20-year veteran with tight silver curls and a no-nonsense demeanor. Their body language. Miguel's frustrated gestures, Diane's concerned frown suggested this wasn't the first time they'd had this discussion. I'm telling you, she's deliberately skipping him, Miguel said, keeping his voice barely audible over the engine noise. It's the third time I've seen her do this on flights with young black passengers. Last month, it was that medical student heading to London. Diane's shoulders slumped slightly. I've noticed it before too, she admitted, glancing toward the cabin. She's careful though, always has some plausible explanation ready. So, what do we do? Miguel pressed. Follow procedure, Diane replied, though her expression suggested limited faith in the process. Document report to the purser, let HR handle it. You know HR will just file it away like the last two complaints, Miguel countered. Then what do you suggest? Diane asked, frustration evident in her tone. Before Miguel could answer, the galley phone rang. He answered, listened briefly, then turned back to Diane. First Officer Reynolds is coming out for a walkthrough in about 20 minutes, he reported. Says he wants to stretch his legs before the approach to European airspace. Something shifted in Diane's expression, a subtle spark of possibility. Reynolds has a reputation for paying attention. Maybe mention what's happening when he comes out. Meanwhile, in row 24, Elijah had retreated further into himself, his body language a study in careful containment. Years of similar experiences had taught him that his reaction would be scrutinized more harshly than the provocation. The slightest display of justified frustration would be labeled as aggression, weaponized to justify the treatment he was receiving. Isabel Garza watched him with growing concern, recognizing the emotional toll of maintaining such rigid self-control. Having taught for nearly 4 decades in a diverse school district, she had witnessed countless similar dynamics play out, the exhausting vigilance required of students who knew they would be judged by different standards. You know, she said quietly, keeping her voice between just the two of them in 38 years of teaching, I saw this kind of behavior more times than I care to remember. It never got easier to watch. She adjusted the shared blanket, ensuring Elijah had equal coverage. The hardest lessons I learned weren't in books, they were about when to speak up. I always regretted the times I stayed silent. Elijah met her gaze, a flicker of genuine connection passing between them. My mom says something similar, he acknowledged. She tells me to pick my battles carefully, that some are worth fighting even if they're uncomfortable. Your mother sounds like a wise woman, Isabel replied. Is this one of those battles, Elijah? He considered the question, his fingers unconsciously tapping the balk, fingering pattern against his thigh, a self-soothing gesture that grounded him in his purpose. The conservatoire audition loomed in his mind, the culmination of years of sacrifice and preparation. Any disruption could affect his performance, his focus, his future. And yet, I don't know yet, he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. But I think we're about to find out. 17 minutes remained until the cockpit door would open. 17 minutes until First Officer Nathan Reynolds would step into a situation where the atmospheric pressure had nothing to do with altitude and everything to do with accumulated injustice reaching its breaking point. Inside the cockpit of Flight 723, First Officer Nathan Reynolds monitored the aircraft's systems with the focused attention that had become second nature during his 15 years of flight experience. The Boeing 787's advanced displays showed normal operations across all parameters: fuel consumption, engine performance, navigation systems, all functioning exactly as designed. At 38, Nathan carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his position through both technical excellence and personal integrity. His Atlantic Airways uniform fit his athletic frame perfectly, 4 gold stripes on each epaulette gleaming under the cockpit lights. The neatly trimmed beard and short-cropped hair framed features that reflected both discipline and compassion qualities that had made him one of the airline's most respected officers. Before joining commercial aviation, Nathan had served 12 years as an Air Force pilot, including 3 tours flying transport missions in conflict zones where split-second decisions often carried life-or-death consequences. The military had taught him technical precision. Experience had taught him that true leadership often emerged in unexpected moments that tested character rather than procedures. Weather report shows some moderate turbulence about 2 hours ahead, commented Captain William Baker, a 56-year-old veteran pilot with thinning gray hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. Nothing serious, but we'll want to have the cabin secured before then. Noted. Nathan replied, making a small adjustment to the flight management system. I'll head back after we pass the 40 West longitude marker. Good time for a break before we hit the rough air. What Nathan didn't mention was that he'd been monitoring more than just the weather and fuel consumption. For the past hour, he'd been aware of unusual patterns in the cabin service reports appearing on his display. The galley phone had rung more frequently than normal, with flight attendants requesting reassignments of duties. The cabin service progress indicators showed irregular timing, beverage service taking longer in some sections, meal distribution falling behind schedule in others. Most pilots would ignore these subtle signals, focusing solely on flying the aircraft. But Nathan had learned in the Air Force that situational awareness extended beyond the cockpit. The cabin was part of his command responsibility, even if flight attendants reported through a different chain. He'd also noticed something specific, an unusual number of communications specifically mentioning row 24. Nothing urgent. Nothing requiring immediate intervention, but enough to register as a pattern worth investigating. 19 years earlier, Nathan Reynolds had been seated in row 16D on a commercial flight from Chicago to Seattle, traveling in his newly issued Air Force uniform. The flight attendant had scrutinized his military ID with visible suspicion, questioned his seat assignment repeatedly, and forgotten to serve him during a 5-hour flight. When he'd finally pressed his call button after 2 hours without service, she'd returned with a supervisor who asked if he was creating a disturbance. No one had spoken up then. No one had recorded the incident or challenged the treatment. He'd sat silently burning with humiliation and anger, swallowing the injustice, because there had seemed no alternative as a 19-year-old black man in uniform being eyed with suspicion by an entire cabin. That memory, usually kept carefully compartmentalized, surfaced briefly as he noted another cabin alert referencing row 24. I think I'll take that break now, Nathan said, checking that all systems were stable. Something feels off about the cabin service pattern. I want to check it personally. Captain Baker nodded without looking up from his instruments. Take your time. I've got things covered here. As Nathan unstrapped from his seat and prepared to exit the cockpit, he had no idea that his next actions would not only change the course of Flight 723, but would establish a new standard for airline response to discrimination that would eventually bear his name. Before opening the door, he paused for a fraction of a second, straightening his uniform jacket, a habitual gesture that reflected not vanity, but preparation. Something in his gut told him this wasn't going to be a routine cabin check. Years of military experience had taught him to trust that instinct. The cockpit door unlocked with a distinctive hydraulic sound. Nathan Reynolds stepped into the forward cabin unaware that he was about to face not a technical emergency but a human one that would test the true meaning of his command responsibility. 3 hours into the flight, the meal service began. The aroma of warmed food filled the cabin as flight attendants efficiently distributed trays throughout the aircraft. Miguel Ramirez worked methodically, moving down the aisle with a cart containing prepared meal trays. "Chicken or pasta today?" he asked as he reached row 23, offering a genuine smile that created momentary warmth in the institutional process of feeding hundreds of people in a metal tube hurtling through the stratosphere. The couple in 23E and F both chose pasta, while the businessman in 23D opted for chicken. Miguel served each with equal attention, taking a moment to ensure they had everything they needed before moving to the next row. When he arrived at row 24, he greeted Elijah and Isabel warmly. "Good evening. Would either of you prefer chicken or pasta for dinner?" Before either could answer, Veronica materialized beside the cart, as if she'd been monitoring Miguel's progress through the cabin specifically. Her appearance was so sudden that several passengers looked up in surprise. "Miguel, you're needed in first class," she stated flatly. "Diane needs immediate assistance with a passenger issue." Miguel hesitated, glancing between Veronica and Elijah with obvious concern. The conflict played across his face professional obligation versus what he clearly recognized as deliberate interference. "I can finish this section first." He began, his tone carefully respectful despite the evident tension. "It's urgent." Veronica cut him off, her voice carrying a warning edge that transcended their relative positions. "I'll cover this section. Go now." The unspoken power dynamic hung in the air between them. Though Miguel held the higher position as purser, challenging Veronica directly in front of passengers would create a scene exactly the kind of disruption she could later report as unprofessional conduct. With visible reluctance, Miguel nodded and headed toward the front of the aircraft, his shoulders tight with frustration. As soon as he was out of sight, Veronica's demeanor shifted subtly. The transformation was nearly imperceptible except to those who had been watching the pattern unfold. She efficiently served James Wilson in 24C. "Chicken or pasta, Sir Chicken, please," Wilson replied, his eyes never leaving her face, watching with analytical attention. She placed the tray on his table with practiced precision, then turned to Isabel. "Pasta, please." Isabel requested, her tone deliberately neutral while her eyes communicated clear awareness of what was happening. Veronica served Isabel's meal, then began to push the cart forward without acknowledging Elijah's existence. "Excuse me," Elijah said, his voice clear but carefully modulated, not too assertive, not too passive, walking the impossible tightrope of acceptable self-advocacy. "I haven't received my meal." Veronica paused, turning back with a look of practiced patience that didn't reach her eyes. Something flickered across her face, irritation that he hadn't simply accepted his invisibility. Special meals needed to be requested at least 24 hours before the flight, she stated flatly. "That would have been noted during your booking process." The statement was so disconnected from reality that several passengers looked up from their meals in confusion. "I don't need a special meal," Elijah explained, maintaining his composure despite the obvious absurdity of the situation. "Either option would be fine. As I've explained to other passengers," Veronica continued as if he hadn't spoken, "we prioritize those who follow proper procedures. I'll see if there are any extra meals after the main service is completed." Isabel set down her fork with a sharp clink against the plastic tray. Years of classroom management surfaced in her posture, the instantaneous shift from retiree to authority figure. "That's ridiculous," she stated firmly. "He wasn't asking for a special meal. You offered everyone else in this section a standard choice between chicken and pasta without any mention of pre-ordering." Veronica's smile remained fixed, but something hardened behind her eyes, the momentary exposure of the calculation beneath the professional veneer. "I'm simply following company policy, ma'am," she replied, the false pleasantness in her tone contrasting sharply with the coldness in her expression. "No, you're not," came a deep voice from across the aisle. James Wilson had set aside his tablet and now fully engaged. "I fly over 150,000 miles with Atlantic Airways annually. That is absolutely not company policy." The confrontation had escalated beyond the expected script. Veronica had clearly anticipated that Elijah would accept the denial quietly, that any witnesses would remain passive. Now faced with direct challenges from multiple passengers, her composure slipped momentarily. "Sir, I assure you I'd like to speak with the lead flight attendant." Wilson interrupted firmly. "Immediately. I am the senior attendant in this cabin section," Veronica replied, her voice tight with barely controlled anger at being questioned. "Then I'd like to speak with your supervisor," Wilson countered. "This young man has been systematically denied service since takeoff. I've documented every instance." A murmur spread through nearby rows as more passengers turned their attention to the confrontation. The teenagers in row 25 continued recording their phones, now more openly visible as the situation escalated beyond subtle documentation. Elijah sat perfectly still, his expression carefully neutral despite the storm of emotions within. This was exactly the kind of situation his mother had warned him about, the kind that could escalate unpredictably, the kind where he would inevitably be cast as the aggressor regardless of his actual behavior. "Please," he said quietly, a note of genuine concern in his voice. "It's not necessary. I don't want to cause any trouble." The words carried the weight of a lifetime of similar moments, the learned response of prioritizing safety over dignity, of absorbing injustice to avoid worse consequences. His hands remained perfectly still in his lap, his breathing deliberately controlled. "You're not causing the trouble, young man," Wilson replied without taking his eyes off Veronica. "And sometimes trouble is exactly what's needed when people are being mistreated." The businessman's statement, delivered with the confidence of someone unaccustomed to having his presence questioned, shifted the dynamic further. Other passengers were now openly watching, some with expressions of concern, others with dawning recognition of what they were witnessing. Veronica's face flushed slightly, the professional mask slipping further. "If you continue to disrupt the cabin service, sir, I'll be forced to report this to the captain." "Please do," Wilson responded with calm certainty. "I'd welcome that conversation." 17 minutes remained until the cockpit door would open. The tension in row 24 had become a gathering storm that would soon engulf the entire aircraft. The standoff between Veronica and James Wilson had created a ripple effect throughout the surrounding rows. Like witnesses to a slow-motion collision, passengers who had been absorbed in their own travel routines now found themselves drawn into the unfolding drama. Headphones were removed. Movies paused, conversations suspended as attention gravitated toward row 24. Isabel Garza had abandoned any pretense of eating her meal. The retired teacher sat with perfect posture, her gaze fixed on Veronica with the kind of penetrating disappointment that had made generations of students confess to undone homework. "I've spent my career watching young people being treated unfairly," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its measured tone. "When I retired last year, I promised myself I wouldn't remain silent anymore when I witnessed injustice. This is textbook discriminatory behavior." The directness of her accusation hung in the air. Veronica's expression flickered a momentary crack in her professional facade, revealing something raw and defensive underneath. Behind them, Sofia Martinez leaned forward slightly between the seats. "We've been recording since the blanket incident," she informed Elijah quietly. "My dad says documented discrimination can't be dismissed as misunderstanding." Her friend Taylor nodded in agreement. "We've got everything: the drink service, the call button, the meal. It's all on video." Elijah tensed at this information. While part of him felt validated by the documentation, another part recognized the complication it created. The last thing he wanted was to become the center of a viral incident before his audition. "I appreciate you recording it," he said carefully, but I'm just trying to get to Paris for my audition without problems." Sophia's expression softened with understanding. "Of course. It's your experience, your choice. We'll keep it private unless you say otherwise." Across the aisle, James Wilson had taken out his phone and was typing with deliberate precision. His expensive watch caught the cabin light as his fingers moved efficiently across the screen. "Atlantic Airways customer service should be receiving my detailed account of these events. Momentarily," he announced, pressing send with emphasis. "I've copied their executive relations department as well, given the nature of what's occurring." The businessman's confidence in demanding accountability, his implicit assumption that systems would respond to his complaints, highlighted the privilege of credibility that Elijah himself might not have been afforded. Several rows ahead, Miguel Ramirez had returned from first class, his expression troubled as he observed the situation from the galley. He conferred briefly with Diane Powell, their concerned glances toward Elijah not going unnoticed. "This isn't right," Miguel muttered, frustration evident in his tone. "I should do something now." "Wait," Diane cautioned, checking her watch. "First Officer Reynolds will be out in less than 15 minutes. Better to have rank behind us." The most telling change was in the passengers who had previously been indifferent. An older gentleman in row 22, who had been sleeping since takeoff, was now fully awake, watching the interaction with narrowed eyes. A woman in row 26 had abandoned her book and was leaning into the aisle to better observe. Two businessmen had paused their conversation to listen. A quiet fury had begun to build among the witnesses, the specific kind of anger that emerges when injustice occurs in plain sight with no immediate consequence. It wasn't just about one passenger being denied service anymore. It had transformed into a moral question that implicated everyone present. What happens when we witness something wrong and do nothing? Veronica seemed to sense the shift in the cabin's atmosphere. Her practiced smile had become brittle, her movements more rigid as she continued serving meals while pointedly ignoring Elijah. The performance of normalcy was cracking under the weight of collective scrutiny. "I'm just doing my job," she said to no one in particular, loud enough to be heard by those nearby. "Some passengers don't understand how air travel works." The comment hung in the air, its implication unmistakable to everyone listening. Several passengers exchanged glances, the silent communication of shared witness. Elijah's hands remained perfectly still in his lap, his focus apparently on the dark window beside him. But those closest could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful regulation of his breathing, the physical manifestation of a young man who had learned that his justified emotions would be weaponized against him if expressed. His mind flashed to his mother's voice during their last phone call before he boarded. "Remember why you're doing this, baby," she'd said. "Keep your eyes on Paris, on that audition. Everything else is just noise." But as the collective awareness in the cabin grew, as more eyes turned toward his row with expressions ranging from concern to outrage, Elijah felt the weight of a different kind of responsibility. This wasn't just about him anymore. It had become about something larger, about what happens when discrimination is either challenged or allowed to continue unchecked. 12 minutes remained until the cockpit door would open. 12 minutes until First Officer Nathan Reynolds would step into a cabin where the atmosphere had become as pressurized as the air system itself, a space where something had to give. The meal service had technically concluded, though Elijah's tray table remained conspicuously empty. As other passengers finished eating, the distinctive sounds of cutlery against plastic and idle conversation created a backdrop of normalcy that only highlighted the abnormal treatment of the young cellist. Thirst had become an increasingly pressing concern for Elijah. The dry cabin air combined with the stress of the situation had left his throat painfully parched, a genuine problem for someone whose audition tomorrow would require perfect breath control for sustained phrasing. After careful deliberation, weighing risk against necessity, he made a decision. When Veronica passed by collecting trash from nearby rows, he spoke up. "Excuse me," Elijah said, his voice respectful but clear. "Could I please have some water?" The simplicity of the request, the most basic of human needs delivered without confrontation or demand, created a moment of perfect clarity. Here was a test of basic humanity. Would a cup of water be deemed excessive? Veronica paused, turning toward him with a look of exaggerated patience. "I'll be serving beverages after I've finished collecting trays," she replied flatly. Without waiting for response, she continued down the aisle, collecting trash from the rows behind while deliberately ignoring Elijah's empty tray table. 20 minutes later, beverages had been served to every row except Elijah's. The pattern had become so obvious that passengers were now openly exchanging glances each time Veronica deliberately bypassed him. When she passed by again, Elijah tried once more, his parched throat making his voice slightly raspy. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I still haven't received any water. Would it be possible to get some now?" Something in Veronica's expression changed, a hardening, a decision made. She stopped, turned fully toward Elijah, and spoke loud enough for several rows to hear. "You seem to expect special treatment," she said, her tone carrying an edge of condescension. On an aircraft, passengers who make constant demands and interrupt the crew's workflow are considered disruptive. The accusation hung in the air, its fundamental dishonesty exposed by the facts everyone nearby had witnessed. Elijah had made exactly 2 requests in over 4 hours of flight, both for basic services that had been provided automatically to other passengers. For the first time, Elijah's careful composure cracked slightly. His hands gripped the armrest's knuckles, whitening momentarily before he consciously relaxed them. Something flashed in his eyes, a flicker of the justified anger he'd been taught to suppress for his own safety. "I'm not being disruptive," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a new firmness. "I've asked for water. Just water. That's all." The simple truth of this statement, delivered without dramatics but with unmistakable dignity, created a palpable shift in the cabin. This wasn't a passenger making unreasonable demands. This was a young man stating irrefutable facts with remarkable restraint. "That is completely unacceptable," Isabel stated, no longer whispering. Her teacher's voice projected with practiced authority. "This young man has been nothing but polite while being systematically denied basic service. What you're doing has a name, and we all know what it is. I've been watching this happen for hours," James Wilson added, standing from his seat despite the fasten seatbelt sign. "It's the most blatant case of discriminatory treatment I've ever witnessed on an Atlantic Airways flight." Veronica's face flushed, deeply professional demeanor crumbling. "Sir, return to your seat immediately. You're the one being disruptive now." "No, you're the one creating a disruption," came another voice, Sophia Martinez, from the row behind. "We've recorded everything since the beverage service. You've skipped him for drinks, blankets, and food while serving everyone else." "I don't know what you think you've seen," Veronica replied, her voice rising slightly, "but this passenger has been demanding special attention since takeoff." "That's a lie," called out the businessman from row 22, who had been silent until now. "I've been watching too. He's barely spoken except to make the same basic requests as everyone else." The collective witness had become too widespread to dismiss. Veronica looked around at the growing number of passengers openly challenging her version of events, her professional mask completely shattered by the unexpected accountability. Something shifted in her expression, a realization that she had miscalculated perhaps, or a doubling down on her position. Either way, what happened next crossed a line that transformed the situation from troubling to untenable. "This section is for passengers who respect our policies," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge as she looked directly at Elijah. "If you find the service unsatisfactory, perhaps you'd be more comfortable elsewhere on the aircraft." The implication was unmistakable. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby rows. Elijah felt his chest tighten, a lifetime of similar moments collapsing into this single instance of blatant prejudice. The suggestion that he should be relocated, segregated on an international flight in 2025 momentarily stunned him into silence. Then, with deliberate control, he straightened in his seat and met Veronica's gaze directly. "I belong exactly where my boarding pass placed me," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying it. "I have the same right to service as every other passenger on this aircraft." The simple dignity of his response, the refusal to be diminished, created a moment of perfect clarity for everyone witnessing the exchange. This wasn't about customer service or airline protocols. This was about fundamental human dignity. As Veronica opened her mouth to respond, to escalate, or backtrack, it wasn't clear which the distinctive sound of the cockpit door unlocking echoed through the cabin. First Officer Nathan Reynolds was about to enter a situation that had reached its breaking point, where the accumulated tension of hours of discrimination had created an atmosphere as volatile as it was unjust. The cockpit door swung open with a distinctive hydraulic hiss. First Officer Nathan Reynolds stepped into the forward cabin, his tall frame and confident posture immediately drawing attention. The 4 gold stripes on his epaulets gleamed under the cabin light, symbols of authority that carried weight beyond mere decoration. Nathan had intended a routine walkthrough, stretching his legs, checking on cabin conditions, exchanging brief pleasantries with the crew. What he encountered instead was a cabin crackling with tension, passengers half risen from their seats, and all eyes focused on a confrontation midway down the aisle. He assessed the situation with the rapid situational awareness that had been drilled into him during military service. The focal point was clear senior flight attendant Veronica Whitfield standing over a young black teenager surrounded by increasingly vocal passengers. As Nathan moved purposefully down the aisle, fragments of conversation reached him, painting a disturbing picture. "Refused him basic service for hours. We've been recording everything. Told him to move to another section." Nathan's expression remained professionally neutral, but a muscle tightened along his jaw. This wasn't just another customer service issue. This was something fundamentally different, and it was something painfully familiar. 20 years earlier, Nathan Reynolds had been that teenager, 19 years old, flying standby in uniform as a newly commissioned Air Force officer. The flight attendant had scrutinized his military ID with suspicion, questioned his seat assignment repeatedly, and forgotten to serve him during a 5-hour flight. When he'd finally pressed his call button after 2 hours without service, she'd returned with a supervisor who asked if he was creating a disturbance. No one had spoken up then. No one had recorded the incident or challenged the treatment. He'd sat silently, burning with humiliation and anger, swallowing the injustice, because there had seemed no alternative. That memory, usually kept carefully compartmentalized, surged forward as he approached row 24. But this wasn't 20 years ago. This was now, and Nathan Reynolds was no longer powerless. "What seems to be the situation here?" he asked, his deep voice carrying a natural authority that immediately shifted the cabin's focus. The question created a momentary silence, the calm center of the storm. Veronica straightened, relief flashing across her face at the appearance of perceived backup. "First Officer Reynolds." She began, her voice regaining some professional polish. "I was just explaining our service protocols to this passenger who's been disruptive throughout the flight." Nathan looked at the young man in question, composed, clearly uncomfortable, maintaining remarkable dignity despite the obvious tension surrounding him. Then he scanned the nearby passengers, an elderly woman radiating indignation, a businessman with an expression of controlled anger, teenagers with phones partially concealed documenting everything. "I see," Nathan replied neutrally. "And what specifically has this passenger done that qualifies as disruptive?" The simple, direct question cut through the pretense. Veronica hesitated, her rehearsed narrative suddenly sounding hollow even to her own ears when faced with direct questioning. "He's been making excessive demands, interrupting service," she began, but the weakness of the accusation was evident in her faltering tone. "That is absolutely false," interrupted Isabel Garza, unable to contain herself any longer. "This young man has been systematically denied service that every other passenger received automatically. He hasn't been served a drink, a blanket, or a meal in over 4 hours of flight. "I've documented each incident," added James Wilson, holding up his phone. "Times, specific actions, witness statements. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's a clear pattern." Nathan nodded once, taking in the information without immediately responding. He turned to the young man who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "Sir, may I ask your name?" His tone was respectful, the same he would use addressing any adult passenger. "Elijah Thomas, sir," came the quiet response. "Mr. Thomas, would you mind telling me your experience of this flight so far?" Nathan asked deliberately, creating space for Elijah to speak for himself. The cabin fell silent as Elijah recounted the series of incidents: the skipped beverage service, the denied blanket, the refused meal, and finally the suggestion that he relocate to another section of the aircraft. His voice remained steady, his account factual without embellishment or accusation. As he listened, Nathan's expression remained professional, but something shifted in his eyes, a recognition, a decision forming. When Elijah finished speaking, Nathan turned to the other passengers in the vicinity. "Has anyone else observed these incidents?" he asked simply. Hands rose throughout the surrounding rows, not just Isabel and Wilson, but at least 12 other passengers, including the teenagers, recording the previously sleeping gentleman, and several people who had remained silent until now. Miguel Ramirez stepped forward from where he had been watching in the galley. "First officer," he said, "I can confirm that Senior Flight Attendant Whitfield deliberately took over service in this section multiple times, specifically to prevent me from serving this passenger." Veronica's face drained of color. I was simply organizing workflow for efficiency." "I've heard enough," Nathan said quietly. The simple statement silenced the cabin more effectively than any announcement. It wasn't delivered with anger or drama, but with the quiet certainty of someone who recognized an irrefutable truth. Nathan turned to face Veronica directly, his voice low enough that only those in the immediate vicinity could hear. "Miss Whitfield, please proceed to the forward galley immediately. I'll join you momentarily." Then turning back to Elijah, Nathan made a decision that would later be studied in training programs across the industry as the gold standard for intervention against discrimination. He didn't just address the situation. He acknowledged the humanity of the person who had been wronged. "Mr. Thomas," he said, his voice carrying both authority and genuine regret on behalf of Atlantic Airways, "I want to apologize for what you've experienced today. What happened was unacceptable. I'll be addressing this immediately." The simple, direct acknowledgement delivered without qualification or evasion created a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The tension didn't disappear, but it transformed from the volatile energy of unaddressed injustice to something else, the beginning of accountability. As Nathan prepared to follow Veronica to the forward galley, he paused, turning back to Elijah with a question that recognized his agency rather than treating him as a passive recipient of either discrimination or intervention. "What would make the remainder of your flight better?" "Mr. Thomas, what can we do right now?" The question caught Elijah off guard, this unexpected invitation to define his own needs rather than have solutions imposed upon him. After a moment's consideration, he answered honestly. "I'd just like to be treated like everyone else," he said. "I have an important audition tomorrow in Paris, and I need to focus on that." Nathan nodded, understanding both what was said and what remained unspoken, the desire for dignity without becoming the center of a larger conflict. "I understand," he replied. "Mr. Ramirez will ensure you receive proper service for the remainder of the flight. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to let him know." With that, Nathan headed toward the forward galley where Veronica waited, leaving behind a cabin forever changed by the simple act of someone with power choosing to use it justly. In the confined space of the forward galley, First Officer Nathan Reynolds stood facing Veronica Whitfield. His posture was relaxed but purposeful, creating a stark contrast to Veronica's rigid defensiveness. Diane Powell positioned herself nearby her presence, ensuring both procedural correctness and witness accountability. Ms. Whitfield Nathan began, his voice low enough to remain private, but carrying unmistakable authority. "I need to understand exactly what happened with Mr. Thomas." Veronica's chin lifted slightly. "With all due respect, sir, cabin service falls under flight attendant jurisdiction, not cockpit crew." "Under normal circumstances, that's correct," Nathan acknowledged. "But this situation transcends normal operational boundaries. Based on multiple consistent accounts, passenger welfare has been compromised, which brings it under my authority as a command officer." He kept his tone measured, neither accusatory nor emotional, creating space for Veronica to explain herself without feeling cornered. "What's your account of the interactions with Mr. Thomas?" Something flickered across Veronica's face. Calculation, perhaps, as she assessed how much the first officer knew versus what she could plausibly deny. The passenger had unrealistic service expectations. She began, her voice taking on a rehearsed quality. He was disruptive, demanding special attention. "Specific examples?" Nathan interrupted quietly. The direct question visibly rattled her. "He interrupted the beverage service, complained about not receiving a blanket when supplies were limited, demanded meal options that weren't available. Ms. Whitfield," Nathan said, his voice remaining steady, "I've spoken with multiple passengers and crew members who observed these interactions. Their accounts directly contradict yours." He paused, allowing the reality to settle. "According to these witnesses, including your colleague, Mr. Ramirez, Mr. Thomas made only basic requests that were granted automatically to other passengers. The evidence suggests these denials were deliberate and targeted. The clinical precision of his assessment, delivered without accusation but with irrefutable clarity, penetrated Veronica's defenses more effectively than any emotional confrontation could have. "You don't understand the pressures we're under," she said, her voice suddenly smaller, the professional mask slipping to reveal something more vulnerable underneath. "Some passengers are never satisfied, always wanting exceptions. Intent doesn't matter here. Impact does," Nathan said simply. "Whatever your reasons, the impact of your actions created a discriminatory environment." The statement hung in the air between them, its truth inescapable. "What happens now?" Veronica asked, an edge of fear entering her voice as professional consequences began to materialize in her mind. "For the remainder of this flight, you're relieved of cabin service duties," Nathan informed her. "You'll assist Ms. Powell with galley preparation only, no direct passenger interaction." He handed her a clipboard with an incident form. "Document your account of events in detail. Upon landing, you'll be met by Atlantic Airways personnel for debriefing." As Veronica took the clipboard, her hands trembled slightly. "This is my career, my livelihood." And that was a 17-year-old on his way to a life-changing audition, Nathan replied, not unkindly but firmly. "Actions have consequences, Ms. Whitfield. The choice to discriminate was yours. The consequences of that choice are not negotiable." He turned to Diane. "Please ensure Ms. Whitfield remains in the forward galley. I need to brief the captain and address the situation in the cabin." Back in the main cabin, Nathan approached Miguel Ramirez, who waited near row 24 with a water bottle and snack package. "Mr. Ramirez, you'll be the primary attendant for this section for the remainder of the flight," Nathan instructed. "Please ensure Mr. Thomas receives proper meal service immediately." Miguel nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Already arranged, sir. We have an extra meal being heated now." Nathan then turned to address the passengers who had witnessed the confrontation. His approach was direct but reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank those who brought this situation to our attention. The matter is being addressed appropriately. Mr. Ramirez will be providing service to this section for the remainder of our journey." He didn't offer unnecessary details or make grand pronouncements. The simple acknowledgement and concrete action communicated more effectively than any speech could have. Approaching Elijah's row, Nathan noticed the teenager's posture had relaxed slightly. The wariness remained in his eyes, the learned caution of someone who had experienced promised interventions that never materialized. "Mr. Thomas, Mr. Ramirez will bring your meal shortly," Nathan said. "Is there anything else you need at this moment?" "No, sir." "Thank you," Elijah replied, the formality reflecting both respect and the careful self-preservation that had become second nature. Nathan recognized the response for what it was, not just gratitude but surprise at being treated with basic dignity after hours of its denial. It triggered another flash of memory from his own similar experiences, the disorienting feeling when mistreatment suddenly gave way to normal human consideration. "I apologize that the intervention didn't come sooner," Nathan said quietly, his words meant only for Elijah. No one should have to navigate what you experienced today, especially not alone. The simple acknowledgement, free of platitudes or performative outrage, created a moment of genuine connection between them. Elijah nodded, a flicker of recognition passing between them without needing elaboration. As Nathan returned to the cockpit to brief Captain Baker, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed. Not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through the simple application of accountability. The shift wasn't about celebration or triumph, but about restoration, the reinstatement of basic dignity that should never have been questioned in the first place. In the galley, Miguel prepared Elijah's meal with particular care, adding extra items to compensate for the long delay. Across the aisle, James Wilson made notes on his tablet, documenting the resolution with the same precision he had used to record the discrimination. Isabel Garza kept a protective eye on Elijah, her teacher's instinct to shield activated despite his demonstrated resilience. And throughout the surrounding rows, passengers returned to their movies and books with a different energy than before, the quiet satisfaction of having witnessed justice slowly but definitively begin to unfold at 37,000 feet. After ensuring the immediate situation was stabilized, First Officer Nathan Reynolds returned to the main cabin. The atmosphere had shifted from charged confrontation to watchful anticipation. Passengers observed him with respect, tinged with curiosity about what would happen next. Nathan moved with purpose to the center of the cabin near Elijah's row. He didn't request the PA system or create unnecessary theater. Instead, he positioned himself where his voice could carry naturally to those in the surrounding rows, creating intimacy rather than spectacle. His posture reflected both authority and humility, a balance mastered through years of leadership experience that had taught him the most powerful apologies come not from defensiveness, but from genuine accountability. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice pitched to carry without seeming confrontational, "I want to address what has occurred on our flight today." The cabin quieted attention, focusing on the first officer's words. The simple acknowledgement that something significant had happened, rather than minimizing or ignoring it, already set his approach apart from typical corporate responses. "On behalf of Atlantic Airways, I want to offer our sincerest apology to Mr. Thomas." Nathan continued, turning to face Elijah directly. "The treatment you experienced today falls dramatically short of our standards as an airline. More importantly, it falls short of the basic respect every human being deserves." The direct acknowledgement, free of qualifications or deflections, sent a ripple through the cabin. Airline representatives typically avoided specific admissions, yet here was a senior crew member unequivocally recognizing what had happened. What occurred was wrong, Nathan stated simply. "There is no policy, procedure, or circumstance that justifies the treatment you received. I am deeply sorry this happened on our aircraft under our care." Elijah sat perfectly still, the unexpected validation washing over him. Throughout his life, incidents of discrimination had been minimized, explained away, or simply denied. Now, a figure of authority was not only acknowledging the reality of his experience, but apologizing for it without reservation. To everyone who spoke up, Nathan continued addressing the broader cabin thank you. Your willingness to intervene represents the best of our shared humanity. He didn't lecture or moralize. He simply acknowledged the courage it took to break the silent complicity that often allows discrimination to continue unchecked. An apology without action is meaningless, he stated. So let me tell you what happens next. First, immediate steps have been taken to ensure Mr. Thomas receives proper service for the remainder of this flight. Second, I've initiated a formal incident report that will trigger an automatic review by our leadership team. Nathan paused, his next words careful but unambiguous. Atlantic Airways does not tolerate discrimination. The behaviors witnessed today do not represent our values. We will address this comprehensively not just as an isolated incident, but as an opportunity to improve our training protocols and accountability systems. The simplicity and directness of his statement, free of corporate jargon or evasive language, carried more weight than elaborate promises could have. Mr. Thomas, he concluded, returning his focus to Elijah. I understand your priority is your audition tomorrow. Our team will ensure you have everything you need for the remainder of the flight. Upon landing, a customer care representative will meet you to ensure your arrival process goes smoothly. He extended his hand, a simple gesture that recognized Elijah as an equal deserving of respect rather than a problem to be managed. Thank you for your extraordinary grace under difficult circumstances, Nathan said as they shook hands. I wish you every success with your audition. Elijah nodded, still processing this unexpected turn of events. Thank you, sir, he replied quietly. As Nathan returned toward the forward cabin, passengers exchanged glances, not of shock or outrage, but of quiet acknowledgement. They had witnessed something rare: accountability delivered with both authority and humanity, neither minimizing the offense nor creating unnecessary drama. Small conversations resumed throughout the cabin, many centering on what they had just witnessed. Phones continued recording, but now they captured images of Miguel attentively serving Elijah a hot meal, of Isabel smiling with relief, of a simple human dignity restored. The transformation wasn't loud or performative. It was quiet, methodical, and powerful, a demonstration that addressing injustice needn't be chaotic or confrontational to be effective. Sometimes the most profound change comes not from dramatic gestures, but from someone simply doing what should have been done all along. In the galley, Nathan prepared for his return to the cockpit, knowing the incident would have professional consequences for Veronica Whitfield and potentially broader implications for Atlantic Airways. But he also understood that the most important action had already been taken: the public acknowledgement that had validated Elijah's experience and signaled to every passenger that silence was not an acceptable response to injustice. In the cockpit of Flight 723, Nathan Reynolds briefed Captain William Baker on the situation that had unfolded in the cabin. He kept his report concise and factual, outlining the pattern of discriminatory behavior, the multiple witness accounts, and the action he had taken in removing Veronica Whitfield from passenger service. Baker listened intently, removing his reading glasses as Nathan detailed the severity of the incidents. His initial skepticism faded as Nathan described the multiple witnesses' video evidence and corroboration from other crew members. Christ, Baker muttered, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Legal's going to have a field day with this one. This isn't primarily a legal issue, sir, Nathan replied carefully. It's a human one. A 17-year-old was systematically denied service based on his race. That's not just a potential liability. It's wrong. Baker studied his first officer for a moment, then nodded. Something in Nathan's clear moral stance seemed to cut through the captain's initial concern about procedures and potential consequences. You've handled this well, Reynolds, he acknowledged. I'll support your decision in the official report. What do you need from me now? Your signature on the incident form, Nathan replied, and authorization for the customer care team to meet the aircraft in Paris. As Nathan returned to the cabin to check on the situation, he found the atmosphere had stabilized. Miguel Ramirez had personally ensured that Elijah received a hot meal, beverages, and extra snacks. The young cellist sat quietly, eating, his posture more relaxed, though still carrying the watchfulness of someone for whom safety could never be taken for granted. "How is everything?" Nathan asked, approaching row 24. "Much better, thank you." Elijah replied, a small, genuine smile briefly replacing his careful, neutral expression. "Mr. Ramirez has been very kind." Miguel, arranging items on his service cart nearby, nodded acknowledgement before moving to assist other passengers. The purser had taken on the section with evident dedication, not just serving Elijah, but ensuring his actions visibly reinforced that equal treatment was the expected standard. Isabel Garza reached across the armrest to briefly pat Elijah's hand. "I was telling Elijah about my former student who auditioned at Juilliard with the same Bach suite," she said. "Different conservatory, same jitters." "Are you a musician?" "First officer?" Elijah asked, seeming genuinely interested despite the turbulence of the past hours. "Piano, but very amateur," Nathan admitted with a slight smile. "Mostly jazz standards when I find time, which isn't often with my flight schedule." The brief exchange, normal everyday conversation about shared interests, carried more significance than might have been apparent to observers. It represented the restoration of ordinary human connection that discrimination deliberately severs. James Wilson approached from across the aisle, extending his business card to Nathan. The embossed card identified him not just as a business executive, but as a member of Atlantic Airways' executive board. First Officer Reynolds Wilson said quietly, "I want to thank you personally for your intervention. I'll ensure this incident receives appropriate attention at the highest levels." Nathan's surprise showed momentarily before his professional composure returned. "I appreciate that, sir, but I was simply doing what any responsible crew member should do." "You and I both know that's not always what happens," Wilson replied with knowing gravity. "Your actions today set a standard that needs to become the norm, not the exception." In the forward galley, Veronica Whitfield sat rigidly completing her incident report under Diane Powell's supervision. The senior flight attendant's expression had moved through anger and defensiveness to something more complex, perhaps the first glimmers of recognition that her actions were indefensible by any standard. As the flight continued toward Paris, Miguel ensured Elijah received regular check-ins and service. Other passengers occasionally stopped by his row to express support, brief comments, or simply a nod of acknowledgement that created a protective community around him. For Elijah, the dramatic shift in his treatment from deliberate erasure to careful attention carried a bittersweet quality. While the restoration of basic dignity was welcome, the necessity of intervention to secure it remained a painful reminder of realities he navigated daily. When Miguel brought him a second beverage an hour after the initial intervention, Elijah thanked him with genuine appreciation. "It shouldn't have required a first officer to make this happen," Miguel said quietly, regret evident in his expression. "I should have acted sooner." "You tried," Elijah replied, remembering how Miguel had been repeatedly redirected by Veronica. Not everyone would have tried at all. The simple exchange captured the essence of the situation, both the accountability for what had gone wrong and the recognition of those who had attempted in various ways to make it right. As the aircraft continued its journey across the Atlantic, the immediate crisis had been addressed. But the ripple effects were just beginning, effects that would eventually reach far beyond Flight 723 beyond Atlantic Airways into an industry-wide reassessment of how discrimination was recognized, addressed, and prevented. As the initial shock of the confrontation subsided, something remarkable began happening throughout the cabin of Flight 723. What had started as isolated pockets of concern transformed into a community united in support of Elijah Thomas. Isabel Garza settled back into her seat beside Elijah, shared more about her background, creating connection through their shared love of music. "I taught orchestra and music theory for 38 years. She explained, her eyes brightening with memories. "Lincoln High in San Antonio. 3 of my cellists went on to conservatory auditions over the years. Elijah's interest was genuine. What advice would you give? For tomorrow, I mean. Isabel considered this carefully, her expression thoughtful. Technically, they expect perfection, that's just the baseline. But what separates the accepted from the rejected is something else entirely. She leaned closer, her voice lowering slightly. Bach has mathematics in his bones, but his soul is human. They're looking for both. From her bag, she withdrew a small, well-worn notebook filled with handwritten musical notations. The pages showed evidence of years of use margin notes highlighting coffee stains from long rehearsals. These are my observations from when my student Maria performed the same piece at her Juilliard audition, she explained, handing it to Elijah. They might help with your final preparation. Pay special attention to the phrasing notes on page 4. That's where most performers miss Bach's intentions. Across the aisle, James Wilson had returned to his seat after speaking with First Officer Reynolds. Noticing Elijah glance in his direction, he leaned over. I don't believe I properly introduced myself earlier. James Wilson, he said, extending his hand. Elijah Thomas. Thank you for speaking up, sir. Wilson shook his head slightly. No thanks necessary. What happened was wrong, plain and simple. He paused, then added with deliberate casualness, I sit on Atlantic Airways' executive board. This incident will receive proper attention, I assure you. Elijah's eyes widened slightly at this revelation. I'm not saying that to impress you, Wilson continued. I'm saying it because I want you to know that your experience matters. What happened today won't be swept under the rug. Behind them, Sophia Martinez leaned forward slightly between the seats. My dad's a civil rights attorney in Atlanta, she said, her voice carrying the confidence of youth combined with genuine concern. The video we recorded is yours if you want it. We can send it directly to your phone. Her friend Taylor added, It's already got over 200 views on my private account. I set it to friends only for now, but people are asking for permission to share. Elijah tensed visibly at this information. I appreciate you recording it as evidence, but I really don't want to become a viral sensation right before my audition. That kind of attention could affect the judge's perception. Sophia nodded immediately, understanding dawning on her face. Of course, it's your experience, your choice. We'll keep it private unless you say otherwise. Thank you, Elijah replied, genuine relief in his voice. Maybe after the audition we can talk about it again. The conversation highlighted something crucial amid the collective outrage and support. Elijah's agency over his own experience remained central. The well-intentioned advocacy around him still required his consent to respect his dignity. From rows ahead and behind, other passengers stopped by to express support in small ways. An elderly gentleman offered Elijah his business card. He taught at a music conservatory in Boston and had colleagues at the Paris Conservatoire. A mother, traveling with 2 young children, told him her family would be sending good vibes for his audition. Miguel Ramirez returned with extra pillows for Elijah's seat. For proper back support, he explained arranging them with care. Musicians need to be comfortable before performances. My cousin who played violin always said uncomfortable seating was a performer's worst enemy. As he adjusted the pillows, Miguel spoke quietly. I want to thank you too. For what Elijah asked, genuinely puzzled. For maintaining your dignity throughout all this, Miguel replied. It would have been understandable to react differently given the circumstances. Your composure made it impossible for anyone to dismiss what was happening. Elijah shrugged slightly, a gesture that carried the weight of practiced restraint. My mom always says that in situations like this I have to be twice as controlled as anyone else, that the rules are different for me. Miguel's expression tightened momentarily, acknowledging the painful truth in this statement. She's right. It's not fair, but she's right. He paused before adding, just know that what happened today matters. It matters that people saw it, spoke up, and that there were consequences. Near the forward cabin, Nathan Reynolds emerged briefly from the cockpit for another cabin check. He nodded acknowledgement to Elijah as he passed a simple gesture that contained volumes, recognition, respect, one equal to another. For the remainder of the flight, Elijah Thomas experienced something he hadn't anticipated when boarding in Atlanta. A community of support formed spontaneously from strangers united by a shared recognition of injustice and a collective refusal to remain silent. As the aircraft began its initial descent into Parisian airspace, Isabel leaned over with a gentle smile. "Whatever happens at that audition tomorrow," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of decades spent nurturing young talent, "remember that you've already demonstrated extraordinary grace under pressure. Music isn't just about technical skill, it's about having something meaningful to express. After today, I'd say you have that in abundance." The simple truth of her observation resonated with Elijah in unexpected ways. Throughout his musical training, he had sometimes struggled to connect the technical perfection he could achieve with the emotional depth the music demanded. Today's experience processing intense emotions while maintaining external composure had created a new understanding of how to channel feeling through discipline rather than despite it. As the seatbelt sign illuminated for landing, Elijah realized that while the discrimination he had experienced was painfully familiar, the solidarity that followed was something new, a counterbalance that, while not erasing the injustice, perhaps offered a different lens through which to view humanity. The touchdown at Charles de Gaulle Airport came just after 7:30 a.m. local time, the massive aircraft settling onto the runway with a series of gentle bumps before taxiing toward Terminal 2E. As the seatbelt signs chimed off, passengers began the familiar routine of gathering belongings and forming the impatient queue in the aisles. For Elijah Thomas, however, the arrival process unfolded differently. Miguel Ramirez approached his row before the general deplaning began. "First Officer Reynolds has arranged priority deplaning for you," he explained. "An Atlantic Airways representative will meet you at the gate to assist with your cello and ground transportation." Isabel Garza squeezed Elijah's hand briefly. "Remember what I said about breathing," she reminded him with grandmotherly warmth. "For both Bach and life in general." She wrote her email address in the margin of the musical notation pages she had given him. "I expect a full report on the audition. No excuses." Across the aisle, James Wilson extended his business card. "My direct line is on the back," he said. "I come to Paris monthly for business. Call if you need anything at all during your stay." As Elijah gathered his belongings, the teenagers from the row behind Sophia and Taylor approached. "We've saved all the video footage to a private cloud folder," Sophia explained, showing him her phone screen with the access information. "It's your experience, your decision what happens with it." Taylor nodded in agreement. "Whatever you decide, we're with you. What happened wasn't okay, and you handled it with more maturity than most adults would have." First Officer Nathan Reynolds appeared at the front of the aircraft as the doors opened, personally overseeing the careful removal of Elijah's cello from the closet. He had changed from his uniform jacket to a more casual pilot sweater, symbolically stepping away from his official role into something more personal. "Mr. Thomas," he said, as Elijah approached the exit, "I wanted to ensure your instrument was properly handled." He gestured to where a ground crew member waited with the cello case on a special cart. "Thank you, Elijah," replied the simple phrase encompassing far more than gratitude for the instrument handling. Nathan seemed to understand the broader meaning. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a silver pilot's wings pin, the kind sometimes given to children visiting the cockpit. 20 years ago, I was in a similar situation," he said quietly. No one spoke up then, no one intervened. He offered the pin to Elijah. "This reminded me why I became a pilot, to navigate difficult spaces with integrity. Maybe it can be a reminder that for every person who tries to clip your wings, there are others who recognize your right to soar." The gesture, simple but loaded with personal significance, created a moment of genuine connection between them. "Thank you, sir," Elijah said, accepting the pin with evident emotion. This means a lot." "Good luck with your audition," Nathan replied. Bach has rarely had a more worthy interpreter. In the terminal, Elijah was met by Caroline Dubois, a customer care representative who efficiently guided him through the arrival process. His cello was transferred to a specialized vehicle for transport to his accommodation, while Caroline handled his passport control and customs formalities through an expedited channel. First Officer Reynolds made special arrangements, she explained in lightly accented English. "We want to ensure your experience on the ground is much better than your experience in the air." Meanwhile, at another exit from the aircraft, Veronica Whitfield was met by 2 Atlantic Airways management representatives who escorted her to a private office. Her face was pale, her earlier defiance replaced by the dawning reality of her situation as she disappeared into the administrative section of the terminal. As Elijah settled into the company car that would take him to his accommodation, his phone buzzed with a message from his mother. "Just landed," he texted back, deciding that the full story could wait until after his audition. No need to worry her when she was already anxious about his performance. "Love you, baby. You've got this. Call me after," came her immediate reply, followed by a string of heart emojis. The simple exchange brought unexpected emotion welling up the culmination of stress exhaustion and the strange mix of validation and residual hurt from the flight. For the first time since boarding in Atlanta, Elijah allowed himself to feel everything he had carefully contained: the humiliation, the anger, the relief of intervention, the gratitude for unexpected allies. A single tear slid down his cheek as the car merged onto the A1 motorway toward central Paris. He wiped it away quickly, embarrassed even in privacy, then caught himself in the automatic response. Perhaps here alone in this moment he could allow himself to simply feel without judgment or consequence. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening online. Despite Sophia and Taylor's promise to keep the video private, another passenger, a marketing executive with a substantial social media following, had posted his own recording of the confrontation and resolution. The clip captioned, "How to Handle Racism at 37,000 Feet, Atlantic Airways. First Officer shows." True leadership was gaining traction rapidly. By the time Elijah arrived at his small hotel in the 5th arrondissement, the video had been viewed 50,000 times. By noon, as he unpacked his cello for a practice session, the count had reached 250,000. At Atlantic Airways corporate headquarters in Atlanta, the overnight team monitoring social media had already escalated the situation to senior management. Emergency meetings were scheduled, statements drafted and then discarded as insufficient as the video continued to spread. Inside a small, precisely furnished hotel room in Paris, however, Elijah Thomas remained unaware of the growing attention. With his cello finally unpacked and tuned, he began to play the familiar, intricate patterns of Bach's prelude flowing from his fingers. But something had changed in his interpretation. The mathematical precision remained flawless, but now each phrase carried new emotional depth, the resilience forged through adversity, the dignity maintained despite attempts to diminish it, the complexity of navigating spaces not designed to welcome him. As the music filled the modest room, Elijah found himself incorporating everything he had experienced, not as distraction, but as depth, transforming challenge into artistic expression. Tomorrow would bring the audition and whatever consequences would unfold from the events on Flight 723. But today, in this moment, there was only the music, the one space where he had always been valued purely for his merit, where no one could deny him his rightful place. At Atlantic Airways' gleaming headquarters in Atlanta, the executive conference room had transformed into a crisis management center by 9:00 a.m. Eastern Time. Flat-screen monitors displayed social media metrics, news coverage, and the viral video that had accumulated over 3 million views in less than 15 hours. CEO Catherine Palmer, a formidable woman in her late 50s, known for her direct approach, stood at the head of the table, arms crossed as she absorbed the situation. Unlike many executives who might delegate such matters, Palmer had built her reputation on addressing problems personally, particularly those involving the company's core values. "So, let me understand this correctly," she said, her voice dangerously calm. A black teenage passenger was systematically denied service throughout a transatlantic flight. Multiple witnesses corroborated the discrimination. Our first officer intervened because other crew members failed to do so. The entire incident was recorded from multiple angles and is now viral. And our initial public statement was, she picked up a printed page with evident disdain. "Atlantic Airways is investigating reports of a service inconsistency on Flight 723. The head of corporate communications winced visibly. We were trying to avoid escalating the situation before what Palmer interrupted her tone sharp. Before people noticed racial discrimination happened on our aircraft. That ship has sailed." She tossed the statement onto the table with evident disgust. "This isn't a service inconsistency. It's discrimination. Call it what it is." The room fell silent, executives exchanging uncomfortable glances. Palmer had always emphasized accountability, but her intensity in this moment surprised even longtime colleagues. As the tension peaked, James Wilson entered the conference room, having flown back from Paris on the first available connection. His presence caused a stir. Board members rarely involved themselves in operational issues. James Palmer acknowledged with a nod. "I understand you witnessed the incident firsthand." "I did," Wilson confirmed, setting his briefcase on the table with deliberate care. "And I want to be absolutely clear, what happened on that flight was textbook discrimination." The young man involved, Elijah Thomas, was singled out and denied service that every other passenger received automatically. He activated a tablet and projected his own documentation onto the main screen, a meticulous timeline of events from Flight 723, with timestamps and specific observations. The senior flight attendant, Veronica Whitfield, deliberately skipped Mr. Thomas for beverage service at 17:42 UTC. She denied him a blanket at 19:15 despite distributing them to surrounding passengers. She removed another flight attendant who was about to serve him a meal at 20:30. When he finally requested water, she accused him of being disruptive in front of the entire cabin. Wilson's precision silenced the room. If First Officer Reynolds hadn't intervened, this situation would have been exponentially worse. Palmer turned to the HR director. "Where is Ms. Whitfield, now suspended pending investigation as per protocol?" "She arrived back in Atlanta this morning and has been interviewed by our internal affairs team. And First Officer Reynolds still in Paris. He's scheduled to deadhead back on tomorrow's flight." Palmer nodded decision, visibly formed. "Here's what happens next. First, we issue a new statement immediately. We acknowledge the discrimination that occurred, apologize unequivocally to Mr. Thomas, and outline specific steps we're taking to address both this incident and prevent future occurrences." She turned to the HR director. "Second, I want a complete review of Ms. Whitfield's service record. If there are previous incidents that were overlooked, I want to know why and who failed to address them." "There are," Wilson interjected quietly. "I've already requested the records. 3 passenger complaints in the last 18 months alleging similar treatment, all classified as resolved after standard customer service responses. No disciplinary action taken." A troubled murmur spread through the room. "Third," Palmer continued, "I want to speak personally with First Officer Reynolds. His intervention represents exactly the kind of leadership we should be recognizing and amplifying throughout the organization." She paused, scanning the faces around the table. "And fourth, most importantly, I want a comprehensive overhaul of our training protocols around bias recognition and intervention. This isn't just about one flight attendant. This is about creating a culture where everyone feels responsible for ensuring equitable treatment." The chief operating officer raised a hand. "Catherine, the financial implications of publicly acknowledging liability are nothing compared to the moral implications of not addressing discrimination." Palmer finished firmly. "Not to mention the long-term reputation damage if we try to minimize this." She gestured to the social media metrics displayed on the wall where Atlantic Airways' sentiment score was plummeting hourly. The public isn't stupid. They can see what happened. Our only path forward is to acknowledge it, address it seriously, and commit to genuine change. 4 hours later, Atlantic Airways released a new statement that made headlines across travel industry publications. Atlantic Airways acknowledges that a passenger on Flight 723 experienced discriminatory treatment that violates our fundamental values and commitment to equitable service. We apologize unreservedly to the passenger affected. We are taking immediate steps, including a comprehensive review of our training programs, implementing enhanced reporting mechanisms for bias incidents, and appropriate personnel actions. We commend First Officer Nathan Reynolds for his exemplary leadership in addressing this situation, which represents the standard to which all our team members should aspire. By evening, a more detailed announcement revealed the development of what would eventually become known as the Reynolds Protocol, a structured intervention process empowering any Atlantic Airways employee to address observed discrimination, regardless of hierarchical position. The protocol had 3 simple steps. Recognize, identify behaviors that single out individuals based on perceived identity. Respond, intervene directly, prioritizing the dignity of the affected person, and report document incidents thoroughly to enable appropriate follow-up. In Paris, preparing for his audition the following morning, Elijah Thomas remained largely unaware of these corporate machinations. His mother, however, having finally learned the full story from viral videos shared by relatives, was on the phone with Atlantic Airways' executive customer team. Her nurses, calm in crisis situations, temporarily abandoned in fierce maternal advocacy. "My son shouldn't have had to endure 3 hours of discrimination before someone intervened," Denise Thomas stated firmly. "I'm glad your first officer finally did the right thing, but where was everyone else?" As the day ended in Atlanta, CEO Palmer made one final decision that would prove crucial to the long-term impact of the incident. She authorized a substantial donation to a music education access fund for underserved communities, with the stipulation that it would be named after the program's first recipient, regardless of whether Elijah Thomas ultimately chose to pursue legal action against the airline. It was a gesture that acknowledged a fundamental truth: some harms cannot be undone, only recognized and transformed into opportunity for others. The bridge from accountability to growth was being constructed, one careful decision at a time. The Conservatoire de Paris stood like a testament to artistic permanence amid the bustling modern city. Its neoclassical facade a reminder that while politics, technologies, and social structures evolved, the pursuit of musical excellence remained timeless. Inside the historic building, 19 international applicants waited nervously in a high-ceilinged antechamber instrument cases of various sizes positioned carefully beside their owners. The room hummed with the quiet tension of concentrated talent young musicians from across the globe, each having survived multiple rounds of selection to reach this final audition. Elijah Thomas sat slightly apart from the others, eyes closed, fingers moving in silent rehearsal against his thigh. The complex fingering patterns of Bach's Prelude had become second nature through thousands of repetitions, but today they required conscious attention. The tumultuous events of Flight 723 had left him operating on minimal sleep, his usual pre-performance routine disrupted by circumstances beyond his control. He'd managed 3 hours of practice in his hotel room before forcing himself to rest. The old instrument, restored but nowhere near the caliber of what most applicants would be playing, responded to his touch with familiar warmth. Despite everything, the cello remained his anchor, the one constant that had never failed him. His phone, silenced but visible on his knee, displayed a steady stream of incoming messages. His mother's encouragement, Isabel Garza's technical reminders, unexpected well wishes from Miguel Ramirez, and several passengers from the flight. He had responded only to his mother, not yet ready to engage with the sudden community that had formed around him. A memory surfaced: his first recital at age 8, hands trembling slightly on the bow. His mother had knelt before him backstage, adjusting his too large jacket borrowed from a neighbor. "Remember, baby," she'd said, her eyes holding his with absolute conviction that music comes from somewhere deeper than fear. "Let it speak through you." Monsieur Thomas, a conservatory administrator, appeared at the doorway with a clipboard. "You will be next. Please prepare your instrument." Elijah nodded, rising with the careful grace of someone who had learned that his physical presence would always be scrutinized more closely than others. He removed his cello from its case, the familiar ritual of preparation centering him, checking the tuning, adjusting the end pin to the proper height, positioning the rosin-darkened bow in his right hand. Bach's Cello Suite No. 1 was one of the most performed pieces in the classical repertoire, a technically demanding work that revealed a musician's fundamental relationship with their instrument. Its apparent simplicity concealed profound complexity, making it both an obvious choice for auditions and a perilous one. Everyone on the judging panel would have heard it hundreds, perhaps thousands of times before. Standing out required something beyond mere technical precision. As he waited for his summons, Elijah's hand brushed against something in his pocket. The small silver wings pin that First Officer Reynolds had given him. The unexpected connection with that moment of humanity amid yesterday's dehumanization created a sudden clarity. "Monsieur Thomas." The administrator reappeared. "They are ready for you now." The audition room was smaller than Elijah had imagined, an intimate space with excellent acoustics. 3 judges seated behind a simple table, their expressions professionally neutral. The center judge, an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun, nodded acknowledgement. "Elijah Thomas from Atlanta, United States," she stated in accented English. "You will perform Bach's Cello Suite No. 1 Prelude. You may begin when ready." Elijah positioned himself on the chair, adjusting his posture until the cello felt like a natural extension of his body. He closed his eyes briefly, centering himself in the moment. The events of the past 24 hours threatened to intrude, the accumulated tension, humiliation, vindication, and exhaustion all competing for space in his consciousness. Instead of pushing these feelings away, as he had been taught to do before performances, Elijah made an intuitive decision he would channel them directly into the music. Bach's mathematical precision would provide the structure. His own experience would provide the emotional depth. The first note resonated through the room, pure, perfectly pitched, alive with subtle vibrato. As his fingers found the familiar patterns, Elijah allowed himself to truly feel everything he had contained during Flight 723. Each phrase became a conversation about dignity maintained despite attempts to diminish it. The flowing arpeggios spoke of resilience, the harmonic shifts of perspective gained through adversity. His left hand moved with practiced precision, each finger finding its position on the fingerboard with millimeter accuracy. The bow in his right hand pulled across the strings with varying pressure, sometimes feather light for the delicate passages, sometimes with greater weight for the resonant lower notes. The G string vibrated against his chest, the physical sensation of music creation connecting him to centuries of cellists who had interpreted these same notes. In the third passage, where many cellists struggled with the transition between positions, Elijah executed a perfect shift, his hand gliding up the neck of the cello, while maintaining the rhythmic integrity that made Bach's mathematics sing. The D minor section often played with technical correctness, but emotional flatness became in his hands a statement of controlled power, each note given its full value while contributing to the greater phrase. He wasn't just playing Bach, he was reinterpreting the composition through the lens of his lived experience, a 17-year-old black cellist from Atlanta who had faced dismissal and erasure, yet maintained his fundamental humanity throughout. The judge's expressions shifted almost imperceptibly. The center judge lowered her pen, abandoning note-taking to simply listen. The youngest judge leaned forward slightly, attention intensifying. The third judge's eyes closed, head tilting as if to better absorb the nuances of interpretation. When the final note faded, the room held its silence for several seconds, that rare, precious moment when musical performance transcends technical evaluation and becomes genuine artistic communication. The center judge cleared her throat. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas. That was—" She paused, searching for the appropriate word, most illuminating. "Do you have any questions for the panel?" Elijah carefully lowered his bow. "No, madame. Thank you for the opportunity." As he packed his cello back into its case, Elijah noticed his hands were perfectly steady. The anxiety that had accompanied him into the room had transformed into something else, a quiet certainty that, regardless of the panel's decision, he had expressed something authentic through his music. He had played his truth, and that was ultimately what mattered. In the hallway outside, the administrator who had called him in earlier approached with an uncharacteristic smile. "That was exceptional, young man," he said quietly. "Truly exceptional." Elijah nodded thanks, not yet trusting himself to speak. The emotional release of the performance had left him simultaneously drained and invigorated. Outside the conservatory, Paris continued its timeless rhythm. Cafes filled with morning patrons, tourists navigating narrow streets, residents hurrying to work with practiced efficiency. Elijah stood for a moment on the historic steps, cello case secured on his back, and took a deep breath of the cool morning air. His phone vibrated with an incoming call, his mother anxiously awaiting news of the audition. As he began to describe the experience to her, Elijah realized something fundamental had shifted within him. The same dignity he had maintained throughout Flight 723, the core self that Veronica Whitfield had failed to diminish despite her efforts, had found its voice through Bach's centuries-old composition. "I don't know if I'll get accepted, Mom," he said honestly. "But I know I played my best not despite yesterday, but because of it. Everything I felt, I put it into the music." "That's all anyone can ever ask of you, baby Denise," Thomas replied, her voice carrying both pride and the subtle strain of a parent who understands the world will not always see her child's brilliance. "You took something meant to break you and made it strengthen you instead. That's a kind of victory no one can take away." As Elijah ended the call and began walking toward his hotel, notifications continued to appear on his phone, the outside world increasingly aware of his story, increasingly invested in its outcome. But for this moment in the clear Parisian morning after performing Bach exactly as he had intended, Elijah Thomas experienced something unexpected, the perfect temporary freedom of being valued purely for what he had created, judged solely on the merit of his music. It was a feeling he wanted every young musician to experience regardless of their appearance or background. A feeling that in the months ahead would shape his decisions about Atlantic Airways' settlement offer, and his own evolving role as reluctant symbol in a larger conversation about equality, accountability, and the transformative power of bearing witness. 2 weeks after the events of Flight 723, First Officer Nathan Reynolds stood in Atlantic Airways' primary training facility, facing 30 senior flight attendants and pilots who would become the company's first dignity advocates. The newly created role would fundamentally alter the airline's approach to recognizing and addressing discriminatory behavior. The Reynolds Protocol isn't about creating heroes. Nathan explained, his uniform replaced by business casual attire that subtly shifted his authority from rank to expertise. It's about establishing a consistent framework for intervention when we observe discrimination happening. He gestured toward the screen behind him where 3 principles were displayed in clear, direct language. Recognize. Identify behaviors that single out individuals based on perceived identity. Respond. Intervene directly, prioritizing the dignity of the affected person. Report. Document incidents thoroughly to enable appropriate follow-up. Flight 723 represented a breakdown at multiple levels. Nathan continued candidly, not just in the discriminatory treatment itself, but in the fact that intervention came so late. Several crew members noticed what was happening, but didn't feel empowered to act. That's what we're changing today. In the 2 weeks since the incident, Atlantic Airways had moved with unprecedented speed to implement structural reforms. CEO Catherine Palmer had personally directed the creation of an independent oversight committee comprising civil rights experts, customer advocates, and industry professionals. Their first action had been to review every discrimination complaint received in the past 5 years, revealing patterns that had previously gone unaddressed. Veronica Whitfield's termination had been announced in a carefully worded statement that avoided naming her specifically, while making the consequences for discriminatory behavior unambiguously clear. More significantly, 2 mid-level managers who had dismissed previous complaints about her conduct were placed on administrative leave pending review. Miguel Ramirez had been promoted to a newly created position, training specialist for inclusive customer experience, where his natural empathy and first-hand experience with the Flight 723 incident would help shape the next generation of flight attendants. Perhaps most remarkably, Atlantic Airways had initiated industry-wide conversations about establishing unified standards for addressing discrimination in air travel. What could have been handled as isolated damage control was instead being leveraged into meaningful reform across commercial aviation. As Nathan guided the inaugural class of dignity advocates through scenario-based training, his phone vibrated with a message from an unknown Parisian number. Checking it during the next break, he found a simple text I got in. "Full scholarship. Thank you for everything. Elijah Thomas." Nathan smiled, showing the message to Miguel, who had joined him as co-facilitator for the training. "That's what this is really about," Miguel commented, "making sure talent like his isn't buried under bias. Making sure the next Elijah Thomas doesn't have to endure what he did before someone steps in." By the end of the month, Atlantic Airways had announced a substantial donation to establish the Future Artists Transportation Fund, providing travel grants to young musicians from underserved communities attending international auditions and competitions. The program's first recipient was listed as E.T. from Atlanta at the student's request for privacy, though that anonymity would be short-lived as Elijah's story continued to resonate across traditional and social media. In Atlanta, James Wilson had convened a special session of the Atlantic Airways Executive Board to present findings from an external audit of the company's complaint handling procedures. What we discovered was a pattern of incident classification that routinely downgraded discrimination reports to customer satisfaction issues. He explained his normally reserved demeanor charged with purpose. This wasn't just about one flight attendant. It was about organizational structures that failed to recognize and address discrimination even when directly reported. The resulting accountability measures were unprecedented in the industry, tying executive compensation directly to verified improvements in equitable treatment metrics, establishing anonymous reporting channels that bypassed traditional hierarchies, and creating public-facing dashboards that tracked the company's progress. Most importantly, the changes weren't presented as damage control, but as competitive advantage. Companies that address bias effectively retain more customers, attract better talent, and ultimately deliver better experiences, CEO Palmer stated in a widely covered press conference. This isn't just the right thing to do morally, it's the smart thing to do as a business. As summer turned to fall, other airlines began implementing their own versions of the Reynolds Protocol. Transportation industry publications featured case studies on Atlantic Airways' transformation. Nathan Reynolds became a reluctant public figure invited to speak at industry conferences about creating accountability structures that empowered bystander intervention. For Nathan, however, the most meaningful validation came not from professional recognition, but from a simple email he received from Isabel Garza, who had exchanged contact information with him before leaving Paris. "I thought you should see this," she wrote, attaching a link to a student recital at the Conservatoire de Paris. The video showed Elijah Thomas performing Bach's Cello Suite No. 1, the same piece from his audition, but somehow transformed further. The technical precision remained flawless, but the emotional depth had evolved into something more nuanced, less about personal struggle, more about universal human dignity. The video's description, written in both French and English, included a dedication that brought unexpected moisture to Nathan's eyes. For those who speak up when silence would be easier, your voices matter. 6 months after Flight 723, Elijah Thomas stood backstage at a small concert hall in Paris's 6th arrondissement, preparing for his first featured performance with the Conservatoire's Junior Chamber Orchestra. His fingers moved through warm-up exercises automatically, while his mind processed the remarkable path that had led him here. The Conservatoire experience had exceeded his expectations. His talent had been recognized, challenged, and nurtured by instructors who pushed him technically while encouraging his emotional interpretation. His Bach audition piece had become something of a signature requested frequently at student showcases and small recitals. Less expected was the community that had formed around him, connections forged through the crucible of Flight 723 that had somehow endured and deepened over time. Isabel Garza had traveled from Texas for this performance, her first international trip since the fateful flight. She sat in the front row, silver hair elegantly styled, the pride of a teacher evident in her posture. They had maintained regular correspondence with Isabel, offering both technical guidance and grandmotherly wisdom about navigating his new European life. "Music is your passport," she had written in one email, "but never forget that your voice extends beyond your cello. Both deserve to be heard." James Wilson had become an unexpected mentor, using his frequent business trips to Paris as opportunities to check on Elijah's progress. After their third meeting, Wilson had finally explained his particular investment in Elijah's situation. "My son is about your age," he had admitted over dinner at a small bistro near the Seine. "He's never faced what you faced on that flight. He likely never will. That's a privilege I was born with, too, one I didn't earn and didn't recognize until much later in life. Supporting you is not charity or guilt. It's attempting to balance scales that should never have been imbalanced in the first place." Perhaps most surprising was his ongoing communication with Nathan Reynolds. What had begun as a formal check-in from Atlantic Airways had evolved into a genuine mentorship. Nathan, recently promoted to captain, maintained regular contact despite his demanding schedule, offering perspective on everything from handling public attention to navigating institutional structures. "The hardest lesson I learned in the Air Force," Nathan had written in a recent email, "is that changing organizations happens both faster and slower than you expect. Policies can change overnight. Culture takes generations. But without the first, the second never happens." The incident on Flight 723 had thrust Elijah into an unexpected spotlight. The initial viral video had led to news coverage, which led to interview requests, which led to uncomfortable questions about whether he planned to pursue legal action against Atlantic Airways. The attention had been overwhelming at first. A quiet cellist suddenly asked to be a spokesperson for experiences he was still processing himself. His mother had helped him navigate these waters with characteristic wisdom. "You don't owe anyone your trauma," Denise Thomas had told him firmly during a video call. "Your story belongs to you. Share it on your terms or not at all." Ultimately, Elijah had declined most interview requests, agreeing only to a thoughtful conversation with a music education journal about barriers facing young musicians from underrepresented backgrounds. He had also declined Atlantic Airways' initial settlement offer, working instead with a lawyer recommended by James Wilson to negotiate terms that focused less on personal compensation and more on structural change. The resulting agreement included the Transportation Fund for Young Artists, scholarship programs for aviation students from underrepresented groups, and specified metrics for measuring improvement in equitable treatment across Atlantic Airways operations. The modest personal settlement had been immediately invested in a higher quality cello and instrument that would grow with his developing skills. Now, as the stage manager signaled 5 minutes until performance, Elijah checked his phone one last time. A new message had arrived from Miguel Ramirez. "Thinking of you tonight. Remember what you told me on the flight. Some people try to clip your wings. Others teach you to soar higher. Your music helps all of us soar. Play your heart out. Attached was a photo of Miguel in his new role training a diverse group of flight attendants using materials that Elijah had learned included an anonymized case study based on Flight 723. As he stepped onto the stage to warm applause, Elijah felt the weight of his cello, its solid presence both a responsibility and a privilege. In the front row, Isabel smiled encouragingly. Several rows back, he spotted James Wilson sitting beside his teenage son, who had traveled to Paris specifically for this performance. The most powerful presence, however, was the empty chair at the end of the third row reserved for Nathan Reynolds, whose flight from Atlanta had been delayed, but who had promised to arrive before the finale. The seat represented something beyond personal connection. It symbolized the unexpected community that had formed from a moment of injustice, a community committed to ensuring that moment wasn't repeated. As Elijah positioned his bow and nodded to the conductor, he allowed himself to fully inhabit this truth. The music he created belonged everywhere, deserved to be heard. Everywhere could not be diminished by anyone's attempt to make him feel less worthy. That certainty resonated in every note as the orchestra began to play a harmony of different instruments, creating something more beautiful together than any could produce alone. 1 year to the day after Flight 723, Elijah Thomas stood center stage at La Salle Pleyel in Paris, the magnificent concert hall filled to capacity for the Conservatoire's annual showcase of exceptional first-year students. The honor of closing the program had been given to him, recognition not just of his technical skill, but of the emotional depth that had become his trademark. In the audience sat an unlikely assembly. Denise Thomas, finally able to take time away from her nursing duties, watched with tears glistening in her eyes, her sacrifices vindicated in her son's success. Beside her sat Isabel Garza, who had become a surrogate grandmother figure traveling to Paris for each of Elijah's significant performances. James Wilson and his family occupied premium seats, their regular presence at his concerts now a comfortable tradition. Captain Nathan Reynolds, in civilian clothes rather than his pilot's uniform, had flown in specifically for this anniversary performance. Next to him sat Miguel Ramirez, now Atlantic Airways Director of Inclusive Customer Experience, a position created in the aftermath of Flight 723. Most remarkable, however, was what occurred on stage. Elijah had chosen not to perform Bach, his signature piece, but rather a contemporary composition he had written himself titled simply Flight. The piece incorporated elements of classical structure, jazz, improvisation, and subtle rhythmic patterns, reminiscent of his Atlanta roots. As the final notes resonated through the hall, the audience rose in unanimous standing ovation. The applause continued as Elijah took 3 modest bows before gesturing to someone off stage, his composition professor, who had mentored him through the creation of this deeply personal work. Afterward, at a small reception for performers and special guests, Elijah moved between conversations with newfound confidence. The nervous teenager who had boarded Flight 723 a year earlier had transformed into a poised young artist secure in his talents and his place in the world. "Your piece was extraordinary," Nathan told him, the two now comfortable in their friendship despite the age difference. "You've taken everything that happened and transformed it into something beautiful without diminishing its truth. That's real artistry." "I had good teachers," Elijah replied, his gaze encompassing the unlikely community gathered around him. People connected not by common background, but by a shared commitment to recognizing and addressing injustice. Across the Atlantic, in a discount department store in suburban Atlanta, Veronica Whitfield restocked shelves with mechanical precision, her name badge identifying her only as V. The viral nature of Flight 723 had made finding employment in customer service challenging. Her current position represented a significant step down in both status and income. During her break scrolling through her phone, she came across a music review from a Parisian cultural magazine. The headline featured a name she had tried to forget: Elijah Thomas, a new voice transforms personal experience into universal art. The accompanying photo showed the young cellist she had deliberately ignored and mistreated, now poised and confident on a prestigious stage. The article praised not only his technical precision, but the emotional authenticity of his original composition, noting that adversity had seemingly deepened rather than diminished his artistic voice. For the first time since her termination, Veronica felt something beyond self-pity and resentment, a dawning recognition that her actions had failed in their fundamental aim. She had attempted to make Elijah Thomas feel small, insignificant, unworthy of basic dignity. Yet here he was, his talent recognized internationally, his future expanding with possibility, while hers had contracted to the confines of a job she would once have considered beneath her. The true consequence of her actions wasn't the lost job or reduced circumstances. It was the unavoidable knowledge that she had tried to diminish someone's humanity and had instead revealed the limitations of her own. Meanwhile, the changes initiated by Flight 723 continued to expand beyond their origins. The Reynolds Protocol had been adopted by 3 major international airlines and was being considered for industry-wide implementation. Atlantic Airways' Dignity Advocate program had trained over 500 employees, creating a culture where intervention was expected rather than exceptional. Most significantly, the Future Artists Transportation Fund had already supported 37 young musicians from underserved communities in traveling to international auditions competitions and performances. 3 were now studying at prestigious conservatories they could not otherwise have reached. On this anniversary evening, as Elijah Thomas exchanged his formal performance attire for casual clothes and joined his unlikely community for a celebratory dinner, a commercial aircraft passed overhead, an Atlantic Airways flight beginning its transatlantic journey. Inside that pressurized cabin, flight attendants trained under the new protocols served passengers with scrupulous equity. A laminated card in every crew member's pocket outlined the Reynolds Protocol, while a discreet pin on their uniforms identified dignity advocates available throughout the aircraft. The connection between that flight and the young cellist celebrating below was invisible, yet undeniable. A testament to how individual courage, when witnessed and amplified, could transform isolated incident into lasting change. One flight had carried Elijah Thomas toward his dream. Now countless others would do the same for those who followed their journeys made smoother by the turbulence he had weathered with such remarkable grace. As Elijah raised a glass in toast to those gathered around the table, his words captured the essence of everything that had unfolded since Flight 723, to speaking up when silence would be easier, to standing firm when dignity is at stake, and to creating something beautiful from moments that were never meant to be beautiful at all. In that simple toast lived the most powerful truth of all, that justice, like music, requires not only individual voices, but the courage to ensure all voices can be heard. This story has touched many of us deeply, showing how a single moment of courage can create ripples of change that extend far beyond one flight or one person's experience. If it moved you as much as it moved others, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of resilience, dignity, and positive change. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and spoken up or wished you had? Share your experiences in the comments below. Each story shared helps build awareness and encourages others to act when they witness injustice. Remember, as First Officer Reynolds demonstrated, sometimes the most powerful action isn't a grand gesture, but simply doing what's right when it would be easier to look away. Thank you for watching and for being part of a community that believes in the power of bearing witness.